All right, Denise, we're good to go.
Thank you, Kate. Welcome everyone on this Tuesday morning, and thank you for joining us for Beyond Displacement, How AI Could Reshape Work and Mobility in Latin America. First, I want to thank Juan Menendez and the LAPA, the Latin American Policy Association, for inviting the Georgetown Americas Institute to partner in this timely event, and congratulate Juan, who just graduated from the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown a couple of weeks ago. So congratulations, Juan. Great achievement. I also want to welcome our distinguished panelists, Eduardo Levi-Ayati, who's a visiting fellow with the Georgetown Americas Institute and at the Brookings Institution, and he's a dean of the School of Government at La Universidad Torcuato Di Tella in Buenos Aires, and the founder and faculty director of its Center for Evidence-Based Policy. I am not going to go through his whole bio. You can see that on our website. It's very long. I just want to use this time for a timely discussion on AI. One thing that I do want to mention is that that's very relevant for this conversation is that he recently published a book with Dario Judzic called Automatizados, and it's about an impact on AI on our lives, both on work and it goes into ethical discussions of AI as well. I also want to welcome Marcelo Cabrol, who is a division chief of the Inter-American Development Bank's Lab Scalability, Knowledge, and Impact. It's a SKI division, and he has been at the IDB for 20 years. Again, I won't go into his bio, which is very, very long, but I will mention that he's a Hoya. He's a Georgetown graduate, so it's very relevant for our conversation today. Just briefly, I'll describe how this conversation is going to go. I'll ask first Eduardo and a broad opening question, and then Marcelo, and you will both be giving broad opening remarks. I'll then ask a couple of follow-up questions. And then we'll open it for Q&A with the audience. Please use the Q&A feature in the Zoom. You can find it at the bottom of your screens. You can ask questions anytime during the conversation. You don't have to wait for the Q&A portion to start, and then I will ask them to our panelists. So for a bit of context, since OpenAI's release of ChatGPT in 2022, which brought large language models to the public and the widespread adoption of AI tools across industries, there have been many headlines, some of them alarming, of what that will mean for the future of work and the labor market. Just to mention a few headlines from journals, the Financial Times did a feature titled "The Great AI Jobs Disruption is Underway." The Wall Street Journal did a feature called "AI is Starting to Threaten White-Collar Jobs. Few Industries Are Immune." And The Economist wrote a piece in August 2023 that talks about the battle between American workers and technology heating up. However, few have looked into what AI would mean specifically for Latin American labor markets, given the specific characteristics of Latin American labor markets, their informality, the division between urban and rural work, the division between genders, how will AI impact females versus male workers, young workers versus old workers? What does it mean for inequality, productivity, wages? So this is a very timely discussion. We will be focusing on Latin American specifically, which is very interesting from an AI perspective. And so I would want to start asking Eduardo to give us an overview on what makes Latin American labor markets different and what does that mean for the impact of AI in the region. And also would like to for you to talk about the 4 questions and hypotheses that you bring up in your latest book, Automatizados. So welcome, Eduardo, and I look forward to hearing your remarks.
Okay, well, good morning. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. I have 2 questions. I have to talk about the hypothesis. Let me tell you something. The book has, I think, almost 12 months, and we were rewriting a new edition, and now we're writing a whole new book because these things moving very fast. And some things that we were summarizing or anticipating in the book, they have to be revised. Not because they are not happening, because the whole scenario becomes more complex. So we'll go over the hypothesis, but I would like to focus very quickly on how this reflects on Latin America and Latin American job markets. So the book We have this hypothesis to order the discussion. The first one, just to get rid of the topic altogether, stated that they will have, in the future, will have fewer paid hours. I mean, there is a discussion about how many new jobs will be created by technology, whether this will make up for the jobs destroyed or displaced by technology. And in a nutshell, our argument is that unless you show me that the new jobs will be in anything different from the ones that are being displaced or replaced, then the new jobs will also be substituted. Because what we have here is essentially technology is substituting a function of the human worker rather than particular tasks. And if this technology substitutes knowledge and content and intelligence, or at least part of this intelligence, whatever new job is created as requiring these same skills will be replaced in the same way. So it's not a question of creating new jobs. New jobs will be created, but they will be replaceable. So at the end of the day, we'll have probably fewer hours. Or to be more precise, we'll have either fewer hours or lower wages because people have to work. And at least in the transition, they will choose to work, even if they have to compete by lowering their wages. So probably the best characterization of this first hypothesis is the labor share will continue to fall. And there is a distribution problem associated with that, to which I will come back in a second. The second, there is a caveat. Let me refine that hypothesis because there's something I've been insisting a lot recently that qualifies that hypothesis. And let me present the case in a very simplified way. So far, even generative AI can be described as a prediction model. And the prediction model typically is a combination of data plus an algorithm. This is a huge algorithm with millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of parameters, something really huge and complex, and we can't actually see what the algorithm is doing. It's a black box. But nonetheless, it's an algorithm that's working on a training set that can be enlarged. The data could be enormous, but still is something that has to be represented in data, meaning words, numbers, and images. So whatever is not represented in the data, the algorithm can imagine, speculate on, but typically can hallucinate about, because whenever there is a hole in the information set, the algorithm gets too creative in a sense, right? It's not really telling the truth or creating anything new. It's just regurgitating whatever is there. The point here, the reason why this is important, is that whatever is not documented of our knowledge is still inherently human. So I was at 3 months ago, discussing with people at the IDB precisely because they wanted to mount a sort of a big machine, big template or site, whatever, summarizing all the knowledge of the IDB using AI. And my answer to them was that knowledge is already in GPT, and the expert knowledge, the practical knowledge, cannot be summarized because it's very difficult to be transferred. It's like the system number 2 in Kahneman's view of how the brain works. We know how to do that because we have done that before, but it's hard to tell somebody else to replicate that. And that's where the expert actually makes a difference. So in that sense, there is a number of tasks that are strictly experiential or practical, or in some cases have to do with personal skills and empathy, that are very difficult to substitute simply because the model cannot capture that, because it cannot be transferred in terms of words, images, and numbers. And that is actually where the human work, I think, is geared, should be oriented, and also the labor training and education in the future. I'm trying to say that all that is documentable and transferable will be eventually replaced, but there is still a frontier that we could exploit, and I think we will be able to exploit that for a long time. And that should be our north in terms of where to direct old and new workers and future workers, like our students. So that's one thing I wanted to highlight. The second, I think, important feature of this new technology is that, unlike what we thought in the past, this technology helps or threatens, put in this way, more the worker with more knowledge because it's substituting the knowledge. So in 2016, the World Bank placed Latin America and essentially developing countries at the top of the exposure list. We're the most exposed, the most threatened by the new technology. And last year, the IMF prepared a report that was pretty much the same report, except with Gen AI inside. And the result was the opposite. The poorer the country, the less exposed it was, because it was the country with more qualified, knowledgeable, skilled labor, the ones that had more to lose. So this tells us two things. First, don't read those reports anymore because they will change eventually. So that's not so informative. But the second is something that we call in the book the Robin Hood effect. That is essentially telling us that if you have studied a lot, and you have a lot of this replaceable knowledge, you are at stake. But if you are in Latin America with low to middle skilled workers mostly, that have to struggle to catch up with new technology as well, this Robin Hood effect might help you leapfrog the education and information gap. And you have to exploit that. And I always put the case as both education and labor market. Our teachers have been typically we think that education in Latin America suffers, among other things, from a lack of qualified teachers. Well, this technology can complement teachers and help them leapfrog towards qualities that you can only find in Scandinavian countries. So in that sense, to be complementary means that you can actually fill in the gap more rapidly than before Gen AI was available. So anyway, so there is sort of a gray area where this can actually hurt you, but at the same time, coming from behind can help you, push forward and bridge the gap. And I think that's that's very part of the complexity of this new technology. Now, then there are two additional hypotheses that have to do with what I would call the difference between the technologist view and real life. And in a nutshell, in a line, actually, the view is that technology, from the technologist perspective, technology advances with technological capability. If technology is there and can do something, that's an advance. And the technologists assume that everybody will adopt that technology because it's faster, it's simpler. And that's not really the case. Technology takes a long time to be adopted by producers and also by consumers. And there are many non-tech barriers to technological adoption. And we cite a number of them. Some has to do with regulation. We wouldn't be taking boarding planes or taking drugs and medicines if there was no regulation behind that, because these are all products that have probabilistic risks, and something has to ensure that something actually monitoring what the company is doing. And the company needs somebody to tell the company itself, you're covered, because if you do this and that, then you won't be sued to bankruptcy. So there are certain things that are still not there, and that's why when you look at how this technology is being adopted, it's being adopted on a very, very marginal level. We are not really doing much with this technology, vice versa. We can do much more once we restructure our way of living, our way of producing around this technology. Now this technology is entering the production on a very marginal, lateral way. And we're still using GPT as a Google search, mostly. So what I'm trying to say is that we haven't seen anything yet. And part of that is because there are a number of issues, non-technological reasons, that technological adoptions can be delayed. And we cite a number of them, including, the fact that it's not being regulated, the fact that some of them don't have access because of lack of digital access, and fear, and some real fears, like if you put everything in the hands of, at the mercy of technology, then whoever hacks that technology will get your life, essentially. And we are moving in that direction, but not as fast as a technologist would expect. And then there is something that we also highlight that has to be with barriers, but are more human-related barriers. And we always put and I like this example. I mean, in 1936, the same year in which Keynes was writing about his grandchildren and assuming that technology will, liberate us, free us from working, and we would work 15 hours a week. Another thinker, Walter Benjamin, wrote something with a very short piece, 5-7 pages. It's called The Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, I think was the literal title. And he was asking this question, he was asking why the Gioconda is priceless and a copy of the Gioconda is worthless. In a sense, what is the difference between the unique piece of art, the thing that's been done imperfectly by the human hands, the human worker, and a copy. And his answer was that there was something he called the aura that represented the uniqueness, the context, the fact that it was done in certain period of time by some people, cannot be reproduced exactly, although it can be reproduced to a point at which we cannot distinguish by looking at that, which one is the original one. We care about the original. And in the book, we're trying to make the argument that the AI is always the copy. So whenever you hear somebody talking about AI acting or AI writing fiction or even essays, or AI composing music, and our priority is that people will not consume that massively, will consume that as a curiosity. But at the end of the day, the aura is there. And I wouldn't go, and I think pretty much nobody would go to a concert played by a computer, even if the computer comes with shapes and figures and even a hologram thinking, like in one of the Black Mirror episodes. So there are a number, and these are many jobs that are associated with this aura. So think about chefs, think about musicians, sport players, and also a number of activities like teaching or caring or therapy that even though they could be replaced, and now in some cases are being actually replaced, the human consumer will care about the human nature, human factor, and made by humans will be a big logo, a big, like organic food or green products. It will be a big plus in a sense. So even if you can replace some tasks, that doesn't mean that the consumer will prefer the industry to replace those tasks by an algorithm. And that's something I have to bear in mind when you think of the works of the future. The last thing I want to say, but this is one line, is that there is a key point, a key distinction between the economic and the human consequences of technological substitution. And the human consequences, we can speak 1 hour, but really would like to treasure human contact and the human specificity, as in the aura, in Benjamin's aura. But in terms of this, there is another dimension, I think even more urgent, that has to do with economics, right? We, in the past 4 centuries, wages has been the key distributional channel in our economy, income distribution and wealth distribution. And if we lose that, we need another distributional channel, because and that's something that's been highlighted not by the left, but by Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. If we lose the workers' income, we lose consumption, because the rich consumes a tiny proportion of his income, whereas the worker actually consumes much more. So, and if you lose that consumption, that means aggregate demands will collapse, we'll have an economic depression, no investment, no innovation. This is like a dystopian. It's an unequal and stagnant dystopia. And to avoid that, we need to think alternative ways of distribution. That's why Elon Musk talks about the basic income, or Sam Altman has been actually financing out of his own pocket basic income experiments here in the US. So I'm not sure it's basic income, but what I'm sure about is that the fewer remunerated paid hours we'll have in the future, the more complex distribution will become. And we need to start thinking how we will distribute income, how we will share prosperity. Even if productivity increases, we'll have the same problem. How we will share that so that we keep the consumption and the capitalist wheel running. And that's probably the key policy challenge associated with AI right now. I'll stop here. I spoke too much. But,
Perfect. No,
that's the thing.
that's a great framework for the main points that we need to be thinking about as we discuss the change in the labor market in the region. And that is a perfect segue for my question for Marcelo. From the IDB, how are you seeing the region adopt AI? What have you seen? What have you been tracking? And where should regional governments be putting their attention to? And also, could you expand a bit on the impact of AI on different sectors, on health, education, different sectors of production of the economy? Thank you.
Sure, Denise. Thank you for the invitation. And I was listening carefully to Eduardo, and working for the IDB. My job is always to bring the evidence of what we see as we work in the region. But let me stop here for a while, because I was thinking about the fourth point that Eduardo was bringing to the table. And let me deface my office for a moment here, okay? Because I want to show you that this New Yorker, if I can get it out. Okay, I got it. So this New Yorker cover, okay? And I don't know if you can see it clearly. I mean, I have a little bit of glare there, but there's somebody asking for, some money, and there are the robots walking around. And I put this on the table because essentially, we need to recover humanism. We need to recover what Bertrand Russell, what all the humanists out there talked about 2 centuries ago, or 3 centuries ago, and we need to actually recover that. The issues of what is ethical, what is human, what needs to be at the center of this conversation is not a technological conversation anymore. It's, as Eduardo was saying, Eduardo talked about the Gioconda and the value of human labor. And I think that's the way we need to more and more talk about this issue. It's not how fast this thing is going, it's how fast we are thinking about humans and how humans are in the middle. Human in the middle is not, and it shouldn't be a concept only of, be sure that the algorithm doesn't do something that is harmful. Human in the middle is what is important to us and what we need to maintain in spite of the danger that this technology comes. I said danger, so I'm going to go into what the IDB is doing now in terms of trying to think about AI and how we invest with the region in AI. The first thing is, the future of work has to be there. And I think that what Eduardo was bringing here, the issue of employment, destruction, and production, it's a key topic. We need to understand the future of work in the context, and this is what the IDB is trying to do now, of at least 3 different factors that you need to think when you think about Latin America and AI. The first one is institutions and governance. We're not Europe, we are not the US, we are not even the UK or China. So what is the governance that we will bring? How we don't want to go on doing the regulatory part of what AI should be? And that goes back to the human in the center. We tried 2-3 years ago, before November 2022, when Gen AI came to the fore, we tried with several governments to work on AI policies. And we invested a lot of money and time trying to help with other institutions, governments, to come up with AI policies. Guess what? AI Gen came to the fore, and those policies were almost outdated in the very moment that we approved them. So how do we think about governance of AI in the context of regulation? That's a first point that we are thinking, and we don't have a solution, and we need to evolve there. The second one is data and infrastructure. There's a lot of discussion about infrastructure. Argentina and other countries are thinking about how to become the place in which the infrastructure for AI stays there. We need to be at the forefront here. The data-intensive, infrastructure-intensive model is not necessarily the solution for Latin America, Caribbean, because of money and because of other factors that will limit that. Issues of national sovereignty and other topics are coming to the fore. So that's the second point that at the IDB we're looking at. And last but not least, and this is perhaps the most important, is talent. The capacity of our labor force to actually work in this area. We are talking here about how do we rethink our education system. And this is easier said than done. So these are the three big topics that we're looking at. Let me give you 2 or 3 more points, which are, I think, important. We discussed this with Eduardo. The numbers about destruction or creation of jobs are all over the place. In fact, if you go to the IMF or the World Bank or ourselves working here, we truly don't know. What I have here as a point is that what we do know is that we're going to need a different thinking about safety nets, and that's another topic in which the IDB has been working for a long while. So the future of work and safety nets. And what I just showed you from the New Yorker essentially points out at how we need to rethink safety nets. And the other thing is qualification. How do we create upskilling and reskilling? And we cannot only think about K to 12. We had that discussion already, Denise, with you too. We need to think about post K to 12 models. In reality, there's going to be a continuum of that. So that point I wanted to put on the table. Forget about the numbers, but think about what is going to be there, needs to be there in place to keep more jobs than what we lose. The new jobs and the requalifications, this continuum needs to be predicated over rethinking also of what are we teaching. And that's the other point that I want to make about talent. We've been talking for a long time about soft skills. And we thought that soft skills were, just, artsy or, a little bit off, and science was the answer. It comes to the moment in which, the capacity to communicate, the capacity to invent, the capacity of innovate, it's the most important set of skills moving forward when you're talking about AI and how the human interacts with AI. The mechanical way of thinking about this is prompting. It's not programming, it's prompting. It's what are we going to ask and how we're going to interact in an intelligent way. Because also, going back to the Gioconda example, we do as a human, we have the capacity and also now the obligation of creating content using artificial intelligence. But the creative part comes from an intelligent use of AI, and prompting is the capacity that we need to have. Our capacity to actually create new content comes from a different kind of education. So this continuum has to come with a different curriculum as well. And let me put the last point on the table, which is youth. Okay, youth, our youth. We're becoming more and more an older population in Latin America and the Caribbean. But the entry point into the labor market, Eduardo also talks about this in the book, the entry point is changing. We need to think about entry jobs and how we're going to qualify our youth to be more capable of entering the labor market. That's a problem that is becoming more and more complicated because there is something that is going on that the thinking, and that's not right, but the thinking is that to the extent that we use AI, Gen AI, we're going to destroy more and more entry point jobs. If that's the case, we don't know it yet, but if that's the case, we need to work in rethinking how we get youth to enter the labor market in a productive way. Last point, Denise, I promise, and I can leave this for a different discussion, but at the IDB lab, and I work at the IDB lab now, what we do is case studies. So we invest in startups that are using AI to solve problems. And what we're seeing is adoption is becoming important there because there's new models coming to the fore. In education, a different kind of basic alphabetization is coming to the fore thanks to IDB, to the investment in AI and education. So what we're thinking now is that new companies, new investors will come to these areas to the extent that we show that it has a mix of good private investment and good public policy value. The public good part is important. So that's the market failure that we're working at the IDB lab. You have a lot of money going into financial services for the top of the pyramid in this area, in AI. You have a lot of money going into advertisement and commercial platforms, there's less money going into what has a important public good components like health, education, and also financial inclusion for those that are not financially included, by the way. Also for the traditional industries such as agriculture, especially for small farm holders, there is a promise there, not a reality yet, of new companies bringing them value from the financial point of view and productivity from the point of view of their business model. That's the promise that we're seeing now in terms of adoption. Are we ahead? We are not. Do we need leapfrogging? We do. But we think that these small projects that we are investing in now might have the key for the future. Thank you, Denise.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marcelo. I'm going to ask a question to both of you, but also invite the people who have joined us to submit questions to the Q&A function, as I will be asking those as well. But you both opened up by saying that you had started either writing a book or drafting policies for AI, but that things change so quickly that they become outdated very quickly. Have you seen any successful model of governments or government agencies creating a unit so that they can quickly react? Because governments are famous for not reacting quickly. And it seems that AI is going to be demanding different things of our governments. And regulation is so important in this sector to be able to take advantage of AI and try to reduce its impacts, like we were talking about in terms of income distribution. So have you seen any success, or if you were advising governments in the region, how would you set up like their AI think tank within the government? Yeah, you can both answer.
Marcelo, you go first.
Okay, Eduardo, I'll take it. I don't know, Denise. That's the short answer. The long answer now. So we've been looking at different models. I just came from Europe now. We're looking at what they're doing there, and how they are trying to adapt to a very consumer-centered regulation and regulatory body that the European Union had, and also individual governments were setting up. So that was one model that we were discussing with Latin American governments. Do we go in that direction? Okay, that direction has the advantage of being very protective of the consumer, but as the Europeans now are discussing, it might not incentivize investment at large in large levels in Europe, and that's a disadvantage. We're looking, of course, to the different regulatory environments here in different states in the U.S. Because certainly California is not the same as New York, and New York is different than Texas, and you see investment going from one place to the other. Different institutional arrangements have happened in each of these places. There's in the case of California, it comes directly from the legislative body, so that's legislative. In the case of New York, you have a body, actually, an executive body that is working. There's different type of configurations. But let me tell you what I think that is most promising at this point. Okay, and I don't know if it's going anywhere, but it's promising. In the middle, okay, because regulating for AI, it's an impossible undertaking. I mean, it happens to us 2 years ago. I told you already that. It's going to happen again to us. Okay, so when governments are thinking about regulating AI, I mean, you can put basic tenets into your laws or regulations, but that's going to be undertaken by reality very, very quickly. What the UK is doing now, it's interesting. We are following that, which is regulation industry by industry. So this is a little bit of a different thing. Industrial organizations around one sector working in regulation or at least governance in that sector for AI. So you have the content specific and the technology specific going together. So we're looking at that as an option as well. It doesn't have a particular institutional pure model because it's private and public at the same time. So, but we need to continue to explore this because there's no right answer for each government in the region or even for the entire region to be. That's easy to say, but I think that we need to not to be centered only, whether we go the Chinese model, quote unquote, or we go into the pure free market model. And we need to find places in the middle because the reality of Latin America is that we do need the government to be at least committed to this effort.
Just a brief, I agree with Marcelo. I would say that in general, but in particular in Latin America, they are in the fascination stage, but they haven't done much. Let me give you an example. Last year, a couple of senators asked me to go to the Senate and explain what this was, thinking about regulation. There are a number of ill-designed regulatory attempts in Argentina at Congress. So I told them, look, in 1 hour, I can't teach you anything. 1 hour, I'll write a primer. So I wrote a primer on regulation in the world, how can we benchmark that, which is again, it's a moving target. And we published that, a paper at the Tela. And then when I tried to prepare something for Congress, I have to rewrite half of that because things were moving and new initiatives were showing up in the world. Now, in Latin America in particular, we have scarcity of these initiatives. There are some good centers in Chile. There is one good center in Chile. There are many in Brazil, I think at the state level. And there are people talking and thinking, but there is nothing really organized. And I would like to add, the IDB is likely to play a role orienting and organizing this in a way that you can harmonize regulations and avoid regulatory arbitrage, which is something that's always a temptation. You can think of Argentina as an example when they say, come here, we are not going to regulate you in any way, trying to attract investment from this new sector. I think we have to avoid that. But then there are a number of other issues that I would probably include under the umbrella of preparedness or readiness, which are different things, but they're overlapped. That the region is also not working on, like labor training. You have to change the way you educate, but also in the way in which you reconfigure the workforce to be complementary to the new technologies. Access. I'm always surprised, really surprised, that you don't have digital access and connectivity in general as a state policy as you have with transportation, health, and education. I mean, this is as important right now. So if I were, and I will be probably helping the IDB with these topics in the future, but if I were at the IDB, I would offer money to actually build the infrastructure to ensure digital access, but also help the governments resolve what is actually clear. The real problem here is to organize the private sector to build the last mile, which is always the case. Digital access is there, but we don't have the last mile, simply because of private sector or marketing perfections. So there are a number of things that we could be doing right now. Technology will be adopted over a longer period of time than technologists think, but it will be eventually adopted. So these 10 years are the years in which we have to prepare. We're doing very little, really.
Wonderful. We are receiving questions from the audience, so I'll start with a new one, which we had not thought about when we had our preparatory conversation for this event. Is if you foresee any impact of AI on mobility flows, on migration from Latin America and Europe, and then the implications of AI for national security and trade related to migration. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that either, Marcelo.
In terms of mobility, it's going to speed up. Something that we've seen before is that, first of all, we don't have industrial shops anymore. This is an illusion. It's an illusion to recreate industrial shops. Most of these new shops will be in what we call broadly services. And services can be performed, the production of services can be performed in an asynchronous and remote way. So this is flattening the labor market. We can work the time zone will be more important than geography right now in strict terms, because you can work from Argentina for a company anywhere in the world, ideally within your same time zone, and thus should lubricate mobility without having to go through the frontiers. So this whole emphasis on tariffs on goods that Trump's government is actually bringing to the forefront, I think, is dated. It's something that's not really relevant for the production process or for the workforce, which is typically in services. So, so that's why it's so important to have digital access, because if I give digital access to the most remote part of Latin America, and you give the labor training so that this guy can actually complement technology, this guy can work literally anywhere in the world. And that should help mobility and should help catch up. It's another way in which Latin America can leapfrog. Instead of moving, crossing the Rio Grande, we have to essentially find a job. You have to speak English or speak the technology language and find a job almost anywhere. So in that sense, it will probably favor countries that have a scarcity of job demands, and at the expense of probably countries like the US, in which the labor market is more dynamic. So yes, it will flatten the workforce, the labor market, sorry, in the future, I think. But you have to access this technology, and you have to access the internet. Right?
Yeah, I think there is not much more of a migration pattern. It's much more of an investment pattern. So internal investment to create the capacities, and create and convincing foreign investors or domestic investors to invest in these kind of companies and solutions. That would be my big question. I'm not worried. I mean, there is of course the top of the top of the pyramid talent that flows. And that comes to, who leaves the country, who stays in the country, et cetera, et cetera. But that's becoming more and more of an old situation, as Eduardo was describing. But that, at the very top talent migrating out of your system, it's a problem. But the more difficult situation is how to create the capacities for investment to come into your country, and how to prepare your own labor force to actually be able to converse with technology.
And not all migration is for work purposes, right? There's violence
Correct.
and other things that are associated to that.
Correct.
So those will not be solved by AI. There's another question about specifically to Eduardo, and they're asking you if you're familiar with the concept of regulatory sandboxes, and would you think this would be useful to test AI legislation in Latin America? And if you have any examples.
Anywhere, I think. In fact, the examples come from, the ones that more I know better than the UK examples, but it's useful anywhere because for two reasons. First, because of scale. You need to prove this in a limited scale and a contained experiment, but also because this is still in the exponential phase. So when we think of regulation, it has to be very flexible because you still don't know the final shape of the animal. At some point, this will plateau, but we're not still there. So when you think of regulation, a regulation is tentative and transitory, and you have to build it along with the evolution of the technology. But there are examples. I mean, the UK has AI data sandboxes, and there is, for instance, the NHS Digital uses a sandbox to improve data sharing protocols, for instance, in this case for healthcare. Future Flow has developed financial crime detection using a sandbox. Typically the sandbox are used in areas in which AI can hurt people or can cause harm, or there are some privacy or security issues. So you have to contain the experiment in order not to create to avoid the downside. But a number of examples. I think there are examples of sandbox in Singapore. In Brazil, the ANPD, I think it's called. It's a Data Protection Authority. Is working under a sandbox to implement the AI regulatory framework, something that was proposed in 2023. I don't know how advanced they are. I think probably Marcelo has a better idea. But Uruguay is thinking of their, the technological pole or technological zone. They're creating one based on sandboxes for particular sectors. This is the way to go, particularly in Latin America. That, and I would say, the adaptation of open source models, because we cannot actually compete. It doesn't make any sense to have a Chilean LLM. Something what has been proposed. That's why I'm mentioning it. But it makes sense to customize the models because there are cultural biases that you won't like to avoid. not only the language, culturally, in the sense that if you take the GPT, for instance, and ask about the ideology of GPT's ideologies, and there is a paper about that, I'm not just making up things. GPT's ideology is essentially like a moderate Democrat, because it's been trained with the New York Times data, for instance. So we would like to avoid those biases in our countries, or at least to create our own biases. And that has to be done incrementally. So the sandbox and the adaptation are, I think, the two dimensions we have to develop in Latin America. And I think the very few cases in which this has been used are essentially using these two dimensions, the sandbox as a transitory sort of text case, and then and adaptation of open source technologies. That opens the door to another issue, which is the relationship with China and with the US, how why China is actually making advances. But it would exceed the question. But the sandbox is for sure. And there are cases, and I think there are cases now in Latin America, at least ongoing.
Yeah, I mean, just to double click on that. When you talk about sandboxes, it's probably an old concept. As Eduardo said, that started in the beginning of this century in the UK, and it was not only for artificial intelligence. Actually, Brazil has worked very well with that, and all the innovations that they have in their monetary system and their payment system, which is incredible. Eduardo, I'm sure you've seen it. Comes from a sandbox, essentially. But let me put this on the table as well. What Eduardo said, a potential evolution of sandboxes, or something that could replace the sandboxes, is small language small language models, essentially. What happened with DeepSeek in China, it might be a solution that we need to explore for Latin America and the Caribbean. And that gives you more flexibility to experiment. And of course, what Eduardo said about open source, there's a couple of companies in Latin America and the Caribbean that are working very effectively with open source data. Red Hat is one, actually. We work with them quite a bit. And for us at the IDB, the open source or the open data model is super, super important. We do work with the big technology companies, but we believe that when it comes to data and management of data, we need to be sure that everybody can benefit from that kind of stuff. Again, large models are a little bit more proprietary. Small models can be a little bit more on the side of public policy and public good production.
Wonderful. And going back to policy and the issue of safety nets, which I think is fundamental in the discussion of AI and the labor market. Have you had thoughts on how it's going to impact different groups, for example, women versus men, given what they work in, urban versus rural workers? And you, Marcelo, you talked a bit about youth, but the younger workers versus older workers. Just if you could give us a few thoughts on those issues and how public policy should be thinking, or politicians and governments should be thinking about policies to address how it's going to disproportionately impact groups.
Eduardo, do you want to take it first?
Yeah, well, we don't know because it is not linear. Let me give you one of the dimensions that you mentioned that I've been thinking about on a very speculative basis, which is age. You would assume that the old guys are more exposed because they are less transferable and they're harder to teach. But at the same time, I mentioned expertise, which is something that will be very valuable. And let me tell you something I call a paradox, and sort of expertise paradox, which is that we have the expertise, Marcelo and me, because we've been around for a while. So now we can use GPT, but still have the expertise because we did it by hand. But the new guys that are built within GPI-related environments, how do they gain the expertise? So there is sort of a paradox, and you have to try to strike a balance when you think of education, because the young guys will be essentially learning to replicate or to use GPT, but their value, their inherent value will be very, very small, much smaller. So you have to educate these guys, and you have to have them make things by hand first. Like when I was a student and somebody told me to compute logarithms by hand, where there already was a calculator, but they taught me because they want me to just experiment. So there is, as I said, it's not linear. A priori, I would think the youngsters are more, affine with the more closer to technology. I can learn these new technologies, even as they learn languages as a complementary skill, better than the old guys. And that opens, a problem, a fiscal problem and a distribution problem. You have to think what to do with the old guys. A guy that's 55, it's hard to retrain, so to speak. But at the same time, it depends a lot how this technology is used. The old guy that has some expertise will probably have something of value that the youngster won't unless education changes it the right way. Gender-wise, I'm not so sure. I used to think that the works that, the jobs, sorry, that were looked more likely in the future were feminine jobs, like care, education. I think teaching is a job of the future. It's not that they're going to make a lot of money, but it will still be needed, right? As it is needed today, and they're still not making a lot of money. But but it will be a job that there will be a requirement to have some human being in the classroom, particularly in lower levels, in the primary and secondary. And so that would benefit women, but at the same time, you could think, is it a feminine job, or it's just because of the current economic environment and cultural fit that women go more towards education? Maybe that's not really anything substantially structural, but something that was a cultural result. So I really don't know, but a priori, I would say that the jobs that are more masculine in terms of purely statistical terms are the ones that are more at stake. So you could speculate that in the beginning it will help, it will disfavor women less. Let's put it this way. And rural versus urban, it depends on whether you have digital access, right? If you don't have digital access in rural areas, the gap will start widening even further. So this is urgent. We need to ensure that everybody, universal access, like transportation. Otherwise, the schism, the gap between urban and rural will continue to increase, and you will have, excess of urbanization that we have seen in Latin America will continue. So again, it depends, but there should be differences. It all depends also on how policy addresses those differences, right?
Yeah, let me just double click on that. I talk about two things in my initial remarks. The first one is entry-level jobs, and the entry-level jobs issue. It's complicated because being old, or as Eduardo said, being this old age gives you the possibility of having the experience to ask the right questions. And we've been talking for a long time that are more important the questions than the answers. Well, AI gives you the answers. I mean, you might have wrong answers, of course, we know that, but they give you the answers. The issue is, how do you prompt the machine? How do you ask the questions to be more precise? And to be even more precise, how creative are you and how sophisticated are you asking the questions? And also checking the answers, by the way, once you have the answers. That's what experience gives you. So that would be a way of rethinking not only how you work with entry jobs, but how do you work together with old people like us and new entrants into the job market? How do you work together in mentoring, in tutoring, in coaching this type of conversation? So that's when we're talking about rethinking the education and the training system, is how do you ask questions to the machine and how do you check on the answers that you get?
Wonderful. So no, we're 10:59, so we'll end on time. I just from this conversation, it seems that there's more questions than answers around AI, and maybe we can ask AI if we learn how to prompt it to help us answer those questions. But there's a huge challenge for the region, both from a policy perspective, a regulatory perspective, and how to adapt it in a way that doesn't widen our income distribution issues and leaves us behind in education, which we are already behind. So Marcelo, you have your job cut out for you to be advising governments
all
in the
do.
region.
We
Yes.
all do, actually.
Yeah, it's true. But I want to thank you both for joining us today. And again, thanks Lapa for having us come to talk about this very important issue today. So thank you again. And I hope